Hi, I'm Dennis, and in this video I will show you how I made this PearlEx with a semi-transparent blade in the shape of a fire-breathing dragon head made out of olive wood. I downloaded a dragon from TurboSquid and modified it with Meshmixer for this particular project. I cut off its head, slightly closed the jaw, moved the tongue up to the center and cut it in half. I made adjustments to the teeth and horns, closed the neck and the cutting plane, and reduced the width to 20 mm. I added the shape of a crescent X blade, which would be made out of transparent epoxy. I then created a groove for the X handle and added blocks to mark the corner limits of the stock. I imported the version without the blade into VCarve, added supports to the teeth, and set the roughing and finishing boundaries of the blade. As for the outside, only the pocket would be carved in the first round of CNC, while the inside would be fully carved. I also added the locations of the 6 dowel holes, 3 of which would be used for the inside carves and the other 3 for the outside carves. The version with the blade required only outside carves of the full dragon head, and I made mirror copies of each version for the counter half. Alright, enough talk. Let's get started. I need a bigger blade. I want to use this piece of olive wood for the dragon head, but it has a lot of cracks, which I will fill up with epoxy resin. It's wide enough, but slightly too short for the 2 pieces of stock that I need, so I will have to be a bit creative when cutting it to size. I assembled the mold that I had made for the violin, drew the dimensions of the 2 pieces of stock on the olive wood based on the tightest fit and minimal waste of good olive wood, and cut the pieces with a circular saw. I also cut a few pieces of scrap oak to fill the voids, so that they need less epoxy resin. I mixed Floral epoxy resin, as it is less viscous than regular epoxy, and therefore better at getting into the narrow cracks. I added a few scoops of Aztec Gold Mica powder from PearlEx, as it has more or less the same color as olive wood. I first poured the epoxy resin into the mold, and then let the pieces of wood sink in. I needed 1 more cup to completely cover it all. 6 days later, the epoxy was hard enough to release the stock and reassemble the mold for the other half of the stock. While the epoxy for the other half is curing, I will start with this piece of stock to carve the pocket for the X blade. I first needed to plane it for a flat top surface and a thickness of 34 mm. I used the same spoil board that I had made for the violin and secured it onto the CNC bed. I clamped the right side stock half with what would become the inside facing up and used a downcut bit to drill the dowel holes for the alignment of the left and right halves of the dragon head. After that, I did a roughing pass with an upcut bit for optimal chip clearance. And finished it off with a tapered 1/8 ballnose bit. I removed the stock and drilled the dowel holes into the spoil board. Then inserted dowels into the spoil board holes, positioned the stock with the outside facing up and clamped it down. I drilled the dowel holes on the outside for positioning of the stock for the second CNC step later on. I then performed the roughing pass to cut out the pocket for the X blade, followed by the finishing pass for everything that would become encased in epoxy. After unclamping the stock, I removed the dowels and carefully sanded the fortifications between the teeth with the Dremel, to finish it off by hand with a small file. By that time, the epoxy of the left side stock half had hardened enough to take it out of the mold, plane it to 34mm thickness, and secure it onto the spoilboard with the inside facing up to repeat the CNC steps for the left side of the dragon head. First the dowel holes for the alignment of both halves, then roughing the inside, finishing the inside, unclamping the stock, drilling the dowel holes into the spoilboard, inserting the dowels, securing the left side stock with the outside facing up, the dowel holes, roughing the outside, and finally finishing the outside. Just like the right side, I removed the fortifications and filed the teeth to sharp, pointy daggers. I also sanded the parts that would be encased in epoxy resin. For now, I focused mostly on cleaning the inside, because I won't be able to reach that anymore after gluing the two halves together. Even though the outside material is waste, they still need to be carefully glued, because this will become the pocket for the epoxy fill, and the glue in between the two halves will prevent the liquid epoxy from seeping through. I laid a bead of translucent wood glue on both halves and spread out the glue around only the pocket and the surfaces of the dragon head. Inserted the dowels for perfect alignment and to keep both halves in place while clamping. I'll let it dry overnight. Before filling the pocket with epoxy, I need to remove any excess glue that has squeezed out and smoothen the seams. I could try to close one side for the pocket with tape, but it will be practically impossible to make it watertight. My experience is that even if there's a tiny crack or hole, the epoxy will leak through. So I'm going to close one side of the pocket with a thin layer of epoxy. I made a small batch of regular epoxy and used a silicone brush to trace the side of the pocket that would become the bottom with epoxy. I stamped it onto a flat silicone sheet, allowing some to squeeze out underneath, and marked the corners of the stock with painter's tape. I removed the stock to reveal the outline of the pocket and put some of the epoxy within these boundaries. I then put the stock back using the painter's tape as reference points and poured a bit more until the entire bottom was covered and the epoxy was touching the inside walls of the pocket.
Oh, must be dragon glass.
No, it's not dragon glass. It's epoxy resin. It took this epoxy 2 days to harden, so in the meantime, I got myself a haircut. Now, let's see how it turned out. Looks solid enough, so now I can fill it with some fiery epoxy. Since I wanted to keep most of the blade crystal clear, I first made a batch of floral epoxy and poured it into the pocket. I needed 2.5 cups to fill it halfway.
That's dragon glass.
A mountain of it.
No, it's not dragon glass, it's epoxy resin, and there's only 2 bottles of it. I divided the leftover epoxy over 2 old cups and mixed in some gold mica powder into one and transparent orange stain into the other. I will allow this epoxy to thicken for about 16 hours so that it's more viscous to create the flame patterns. The next day, I carefully dripped some gold colored epoxy into the clear epoxy surface, added a few dashes of orange, and then a bit more gold, after which I made several random swirls with the chopstick. I added a bit more colored epoxy resin and then carefully put a layer of clear transparent epoxy on top of it, and gave it a few more swirls. I popped the bubbles with a heat gun, and then carefully poured 2 more cups of clear epoxy on top. This epoxy will take another week or so to be hard enough for the next round of CNC. But since this is a video, you don't have to wait that long. I can simply snap my fingers, and here we are, 1 week later. This sounds solid enough. Let's take it to the shed for the last few CNC carves. With so much epoxy to be carved, I attached covers to prevent the static epoxy flakes from clogging up the gantry rails and belts. Once everything was covered, I drilled the dowel holes into the spoilboard, inserted the dowels into the corresponding holes in a stock, positioned it, and clamped it down. I then ran the roughing pass of the right side. Followed by the finishing pass. After the right side was done, I inserted the dowels in the right side and flipped the stock with the left side facing up to repeat the mirrored copies of the roughing and finishing passes. All the CNC carves are completed, so now I can take it out of the stock to do some manual cleanup. I carefully cut the tabs, sanded the stubs with the Dremel, filed the carving scars, sanded the wood, and used a scraper to smoothen the epoxy blade.
Isn't easy making a blade that big with dragon glass.
Yeah, except that it's not dragon glass. You know what? It is dragon glass.
Dragon glass.
Yes, dragon glass. I bought a pre-shaped hickory X handle, which I will cut to size and shape the top so that it fits the pre-made hole in the X blade. After cutting off the original top, I used the Dremel to roughly shape the new top, and a sheet of sanding paper for a precise fit. I then shaped the pommel with a Dremel sanding drum and removed the textured paint with the flap wheel. I marked the exact depth, put a thin bead of translucent wood glue at places where the handle makes contact with the X head, and carefully slid it in to the right depth. And as usual, I will let it dry overnight. I will brush clear varnish onto the wooden handle and a dragon head, but use a spray can to cover the epoxy for a smooth surface and to give the blade a transparent, crystal clear finish. After 2 layers with 10 to 15 minutes drying in between, I left it to fully harden with the blade in a horizontal position so that the varnish wouldn't run. I bought a roll of bicycle handlebar tape made out of real cork and some golden tacks to decorate the grip. But they're not real gold. I chose this over leather wrapping because the cork has a nice swirly pattern and color that match the erratic grain of olive wood. I used a sharp knife to cut the tape at an angle and drilled pilot holes to then carefully hammer 8 decorative tacks with 4 different diameters in place on each side of the handle. So that's it. Not intended for real battle, but who cares? I wasn't planning on hunting dragons anyway. The flames with swirls of gold and orange turned out quite well, and a technique of filling a 3D shape with epoxy followed by a second round of CNC was actually a test for another project that I have in mind. So stay tuned, and thank you for watching.